Hi, everybody. My name is Rob Fagan, and I've been invited by Wheaton College to talk to you a little bit today about rethinking disaster management in a complex world. I greatly appreciate the invitation. I've been working in the emergency management and humanitarian assistance space for over 25 years in different types of capacities. At the United States federal government level, I've served in the Department of State as an emergency planner and exercise planner as well, advising senior leaders on crisis management and response. And most recently, I worked in the Small Business Administration of the United States federal government as the Deputy Director for Disaster Recovery. So, why is disaster management so complicated? Well, I think we could talk for an hour about this or more, and we won't. I'll try to put this together succinctly. First of all, why is this difficult? Because many of the elements of disaster management are stovepiped. And what do I mean by stovepiped? They exist in parallel fashion in lots of different ways. One is the budgetary mechanisms that take care of this. Whose responsibility is it? We have a tendency to say in our industry that all disasters are local, but what does that really mean in terms of who pays for these things and who should budget for them? In the United States, there's a local, state, and federal government responsibilities, but who does what to whom, especially now in this exceedingly complex world in our current administration, when we talk about the dissolution of FEMA and putting those responsibilities that had been at the national level onto the state systems. There are, of course, positive aspects of that, in that those who are suffering disasters will manage them a little more locally. In a very simple way, we can say that people in Pennsylvania, for example, can manage Pennsylvania problems better than those outside of Pennsylvania, to just look at it in a very simple way. But this is terribly complicated from a resource perspective, because if states in the United States are going to manage this, there's a tremendous disparity in the wealth of different states and the budgetary planning for disaster management. For example, I think we can all agree that the state of New York has a lot more resources than the state of Mississippi. So when a very large hurricane befalls Mississippi, will it only be Mississippi's responsibility to take care of that? If that's the case, they're probably not resourced for it. So there's the budgetary aspect and the fiduciary responsibility of why disaster management is very complicated. But also, there is just the simple discussion of what disaster management is. Because if we can agree that there is a pre-event and post-event phases. So in pre-event, we can talk about mitigation, preparedness, protection as things that need to be done. However, most budgets and most organizations are set up for response and recovery. So when you look at that, you think about, are we going to wait for when things happen and then we throw resources at the problem and we only concentrate on response? Or should we be more responsible and prepare for large emergencies and disasters and try and mitigate them and prepare for them and even protect ourselves from them? And so the problem with that, though, is when we talk to locally elected leaders, no one is against disaster management, of course. But when we say we want you to invest millions and millions and millions of dollars in mitigation and preparedness, most people would say, well, we have a lot of budgetary challenges. Why do you want me to spend so much money on something that may not happen? And so there's a challenge in expressing to people why we should invest in pre-event activities. From a financial point of view, I can tell you there's lots of articles and research that would tell you that for every dollar you spend before an event, you can save $7 or more in response and recovery. But when we think about disaster management, it's always the response and the recovery that gets the press, if you will, that gets the attention, and yet really in complex disaster management, any disaster management, we need to worry about mitigation and protection, because in an ideal world, we could even mitigate ourselves away from needing a response if we apply dollars correctly and do the right things. Also, another complex problem is that even the definition of what a disaster is or an emergency is and the size of it is problematic, because organizations will always want another organization to pay for the issues. If a large tornado, for example, hits a town and the town is overwhelmed by it, the town will ask the county for money, and the county will in turn ask the state for money, and in turn the state will ask the federal government for money. This has become almost habitual in terms of how we respond to these things financially. And so it creates this dynamic of outsourcing your safety and security to another higher level of entity. And so that makes things very complex in terms of trying to understand who's responsible for response and recovery, who does this, who in the community should be doing this. I will share with you a personal philosophy, and that is disaster preparedness, emergency preparedness, and is everyone's responsibility. The triangle, if you will, of emergency preparedness starts with the individual citizen and their families. This is how we can mitigate and prepare better for emergencies, although they're very complex. Now, you'll note that all of your state level planning agencies and emergency plans and emergency operations plans are built on the fact that the average citizen, barring the threat to life, limb, property, and the environment, is supposed to be prepared for 72 hours in a large scale event, because first response agencies will be very busy. And so you're supposed to be able to be on your own for 72 hours. However, all the governments at the local, state, and federal level do a very poor job of communicating this to the average citizen. So most citizens don't know it. And if they do know it, they don't like to think about it, and they don't like to spend money, time, effort, resources, or psychological investment in thinking that bad things can happen to them. So that makes this more complex as well. Whose responsibility is this? Oh, it's not mine, it's somebody else's. And another thing that doesn't help us is the fact that over the course of the last 100 years, emergency medical, search and rescue, law enforcement, and fire have become ever more highly professionalized, certified, and much more able to take care of things than they were 50 to 100 years ago. And so the better these forces get, all of our first response agencies and 911 operators too, the more citizens can say, well, this is somebody else's responsibility. So when we look at disasters, if we can just look at two broad categories, that is natural disasters and then human-caused disasters. And I know people can divide these in lots of different ways, hazardous materials or technological, but I want to stay away from that right now. We'll just talk about two big things. One, in the natural category, this world is ever more complex because many natural disasters are increasing in number, severity, and frequency. And you don't have to be in one political party or another. You don't have to be wedded to one kind of scientific fact or another. That's the great thing about being an emergency manager. I don't have to weed through all of this science. I can just point to lots of statistics about how all of these things are increasing. So as an emergency planner, as an emergency manager, I want to make sure that my communities and the people that I support, the organizations that I work for, start preparing for these things. So that makes this more of a complex world. Also, the more dependent we become on AI, on robotics, on all of the things that are in the cyberspace and the internet, the more fragile we become. And so long-term power outages, I believe, could have been in the past looked at as these kind of separate things that were ancillary to emergencies. But I would like everybody to please put them in the pantheon of disasters we have to prepare for, because a current world without electricity and without power creates a lot of fragility, and there's a lot of issues that will secondarily and tertiarily come about because of the loss of power. So disaster management is a more complex world because we are more fragile, we are ever more dependent on electricity, and we are ever more dependent on the internet. And so all of these things, with the increased complexity, the fact that we are way overbuilt in lots of urban spaces and lots of wildland fire interfaces, make it more complex as well. And so I think, to sum up, these things are going to become increasingly more difficult, and you, as an emergency manager, are going to have to deal with more and more issues related to responsibility of who pays for things, budgeting for it, and trying to figure out where to put resources, because there's just a little bit of peanut butter and there's a huge slice of bread with all the things that we have to worry about. And again, I look forward to making more videos for Wheaton College. My name is Rob Fagan, and I'll be with you again soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.